His name was Sméagol, and before anything else happened to him, he was ordinary. Not heroic, not tragic, not destined. He was a small, curious creature who lived by a river in the Gladden Fields, who had a grandmother who was important in his community, who liked to explore places where others did not go, who climbed trees and looked for roots in the ground and dove into pools deeper than his companions wanted to go. He had a cousin named Déagol who was his closest friend. He had a family. He had, in the way that ordinary people have, a life that was proceeding in the ordinary direction, toward more of the same, toward the slow accumulation of days that did not much distinguish themselves from one another, toward whatever passes for a normal existence among river-dwelling creatures in the third age of Middle-earth. He was a store hobbit, or something very close to one. Tolkien is careful in how he categorizes the creatures of the Gladden Fields, noting that they were a river-dwelling people who were related to, but distinct from, the hobbits of the Shire. They were somewhat more inclined to water and somewhat less inclined to the kinds of social structures that the Shire would eventually develop, but the kinship was real. Bilbo and Frodo, when they met Gollum, were meeting something like a very distant and very degraded cousin. That connection matters. Tolkien built it in deliberately. On a spring day in the 24th century of the Third Age, roughly 2,500 years before the War of the Ring, Sméagol and Déagol went fishing together in the Gladden River. Déagol fell into the water. In the river bottom, his hand closed around something. He pulled it up and looked at it, a ring, gold, bright, lying in his palm. It was beautiful in the way that only objects of great craftsmanship are beautiful, objects made with a purpose that the maker has fully realized in the form. It caught the light of the river in a way that made it seem to have its own inner light. It was small and perfect, and he held it and felt it was his. Sméagol had been watching. He saw the ring. He felt, immediately, that he wanted it. Not in the ordinary way a person wants something nice that belongs to someone else and knows they cannot have it and moves on. The want was different. The want was of the order of necessity, immediate and total, a want that bypassed the ordinary calculations of fairness and friendship and social obligation and lodged itself in the center of his attention as the single most important thing. He asked Déagol to give it to him. It was his birthday, he said, a birthday present. Déagol said no, it was his find. He was going to keep it. Sméagol killed him. The murder was the first act. The first consequence of the ring's existence reaching out and touching someone who had no defenses against it. Sméagol was not an evil person before that morning. He was curious and acquisitive, and perhaps somewhat self-centered in the way of people who are used to getting what they want. But he was not a murderer. He had not been, before the ring, the kind of creature who killed his cousin for jewelry. The ring made him that, in a moment. And then it made him everything else it made him, over the next 500 years. Sméagol's family cast him out. When they found out what he had done, the grandmother who had been important in the community drove him away. He was not welcome among his own people, which is the oldest and most fundamental punishment, exile from the community that gives you your identity and your place in the world. He took the ring and went underground. The place he found was a cave in the misty mountains, deep under the roots of the rock, next to a cold lake that no light ever reached from above. He lived there alone for the better part of 5 centuries. No sunlight, no company, no food except what he could catch in the lake. No conversation except what he had with himself, which gradually divided into 2 voices with distinct personalities, distinct names, distinct relationships to each other. Gollum was what the other hobbits in the Gladden Fields had called him, after the murder, because of the horrible swallowing sound he made in his throat. He adopted it as the name for the part of himself that the ring had created, the dominant part, the hungry and suspicious and malicious part, the part that called the ring his precious and plotted and schemed against any threat to his possession of it. Sméagol was the older name, the original name, the name belonging to the creature who had existed before the ring and who continued to exist in diminishing form as the years passed. Sméagol was what the ring had not quite finished destroying. Sméagol was the capacity for attachment, for something like loyalty, for the faint residue of the creature who had once had a grandmother and a cousin and a spring fishing trip as the center of his world. What 500 years underground does to a body, Tolkien describes with clinical precision. Sméagol's eyes grew very large. In the dark, the pupils expanded permanently to catch any available light, and the eyes became huge and pale and luminous, adapted to darkness in the way of cave creatures, sensitive to light that would have been invisible to ordinary hobbit eyes, pained by ordinary daylight that was now too bright, too harsh, too full. His skin grew pale and thin. Without sunlight, the skin lost whatever color it had had, stretched over the increasingly prominent bones of his face and hands, becoming transparent in places, showing the structure underneath. He was slight to begin with, and he became slighter, reduced by the diet and the darkness to a minimum of flesh, all bone and tendon, and the bare requirements of life. His teeth became specialized. He ate raw fish, exclusively, caught in the lake with his bare hands or snatched from the surface at speeds that the speed of his hands had become capable of through long practice. His teeth adapted over the centuries to this diet, becoming sharper and more prominent, adapted to the kind of eating that does not involve cooking or cutting or any of the civilizing intermediaries between food and consumption. He spoke to himself so much and spoke to others so rarely that his voice changed. The elvish languages that the hobbits of the Gladden Fields would have had some knowledge of, the common tongue of Middle-earth, these he retained in degraded form. His vocabulary narrowed, his syntax simplified. He referred to himself in the third person, which was partly a consequence of the split in his personality, and partly a consequence of what happens to language when it is used mostly in conversation with yourself, and you begin to think of yourself as the character in a story rather than the speaker of it. The ring preserved him. This is the central physiological fact of Gollum's existence, and the fact that makes his story both pitiable and terrible in equal measure. Without the ring, Sméagol would have died. Whatever the Stoor Hobbit lifespan was, it would have ended centuries before the War of the Ring. He would have lived his ordinary life and died an ordinary death, and been mourned by whoever was left to mourn him, if anyone was, and been forgotten in the way of ordinary creatures who do not do extraordinary things. The ring kept him alive. It extended his life the way it extended Bilbo's life, through some property of the ring's power that translated into a kind of conservation of the life force of whoever carried it. It did not make him immortal. It stretched his life beyond its natural term, the way a rubber band stretched beyond its natural elasticity gets thin and translucent before it snaps. Tolkien used this image in various ways in his writing. The ring-bearer, he noted, does not gain new life from the ring. The ring holds the bearer's natural life in suspension, allows it to continue past its natural term, but the life becomes attenuated, thinned out, the person growing less rather than growing. Bilbo felt it and described it. Stretched, he said, like butter scraped over too much bread. For Gollum, this stretching lasted 500 years. 500 years of holding a life past its term, of staying alive through a mechanism that had other interests than the welfare of the one it preserved. The ring preserved Gollum because it needed a bearer, because a living bearer was more used to it than a dead one, because the ring's long purpose was to return to Sauron, and a living Gollum on the move was more likely to eventually lead it there than a dead one underground. The ring was using Gollum. Gollum was using the ring. The relationship was mutual exploitation, and it went on for 5 centuries. The split in Gollum's personality is one of the most psychologically sophisticated things Tolkien ever wrote. Tolkien scholars have debated what exactly the split represents, whether it is a representation of dissociation under extreme stress, whether it is a dramatization of internal moral conflict, whether it is simply what happens when a creature is isolated for long enough that it loses the ability to maintain a unified self. The answer is probably all three, and more than all three, because Tolkien was not working from a single psychological model, but from a deeper and more intuitive sense of what prolonged possession by an evil object would do to a person. What is clear is that Sméagol and Gollum are not simply two sides of a coin. They are not equal. Gollum is the larger and more dominant personality by the time the story begins in the Third Age. He is the survival personality, the one adapted to the conditions of existence underground and in the dark, the one whose interests align most closely with the ring's interests, the one who will do whatever is necessary to keep possession of the ring. Sméagol is smaller, weaker, surviving in the spaces that Gollum leaves unfilled. He is capable of something like affection, something like loyalty, something like wanting to be good, even if he cannot fully be good. When Frodo calls him Sméagol and treats him with something approaching respect, it is Sméagol who responds, who tries to rise to the treatment, who briefly becomes something better than what he has been for centuries. Tolkien was showing, through this, that whatever the ring had done to Sméagol, it had not completed its destruction, that somewhere inside the creature who had been underground for 500 years, there was still a creature who could respond to kindness. And this residual capacity was not only moving, but, in Tolkien's theology, significant. Bilbo found Gollum in the dark of the misty mountains, having stumbled down a goblin tunnel and gotten himself thoroughly lost. The encounter in Riddles in the Dark is one of the most famous scenes in modern fantasy, and its fame is well earned because it is doing something extraordinary. On the surface, it is a riddle game between two lost creatures in the dark, the stakes being Gollum's supper versus Bilbo's passage. Underneath it is the pivotal moment in the history of the Third Age. The ring passed to Bilbo in that cave, not as the prize in the riddle game, not exactly, but as the consequence of Bilbo picking it up from the cave floor when he stumbled over it, before the riddle game even began. The ring was already in his pocket, already on his finger when it suited him, already doing what rings of power do, making itself at home in a new bearer. Gollum lost the riddle game, or Bilbo cheated, depending on how you read the scene. Bilbo escaped through the underground tunnels and out onto the mountainside, invisible in his ring, while Gollum wailed behind him, having lost his precious and his supper and the only thing that had given his existence meaning for 5 centuries. Tolkien tells us, in a crucial moment, that Bilbo saw Gollum in the dark before he slipped away, crouched and weeping on a rock above the Black Lake, alone and small and completely bereft. And Bilbo felt pity. He did not kill Gollum. He could have killed Gollum. He was invisible and armed, and Gollum was facing away. He chose not to kill. Tolkien called this, in his letters, the most important choice in the book. Gollum's response to losing the ring was to leave the misty mountains. He had been underground for 5 centuries. He had not seen the sun in all that time. Not really, not willingly. He had crept out occasionally at night, in the early centuries of his tenure in the cave, but he had retreated from the light even then. By the time Bilbo found him and escaped with the ring, Gollum was so thoroughly a creature of darkness that ordinary daylight was a physical pain to him. He left anyway. He went in pursuit of the ring. He had no other purpose, nothing else to go toward, nothing to live for except recovering what he had lost. The ring had been everything: companion, comfort, identity, reason to stay alive. Without it, the attenuated life it had been preserving had no reason to continue, and the only thing that gave it reason was the possibility of recovering it. So he went south, following what he could sense of the ring's trail, moving through the world like a ghost, living in wild places, eating raw things, avoiding sunlight and company, and any creature who might ask who he was or what he was doing. For decades he searched. He came close, eventually, to the Shire, to Hobbiton, to the neighborhood where the ring was. He lurked on the borders of Hobbit territory, not knowing exactly where the ring was, sensing its general direction, close enough that the ring could have sensed him in return. And then something happened. Sauron's servants found Gollum first. Gollum was captured by the Nazgul and taken to Mordor. What happened to Gollum in Mordor is something Tolkien describes in the briefest possible terms, and the brevity itself is a kind of mercy. Sauron interrogated him. Sauron's interrogation methods were not gentle. They never were. The same power that had broken Celebrimbor and destroyed the Noldorin smiths of Eregion, that had tortured its way through centuries of prisoners, was applied to one small, half-destroyed creature who had been keeping secrets for 500 years. Gollum told Sauron what he knew. The ring had been found by a creature called Baggins, a hobbit in the Shire. The name Baggins was what Gollum gave him. The name Shire was what Gollum gave him. These two facts, extracted from Gollum in Mordor, were the facts that sent the Nazgul west, that set the events of the Fellowship of the Ring in motion, that led to the attack on Weathertop and the flight to Rivendell, and the Council and the quest. Everything that followed from those events traces back to Gollum's interrogation in Mordor. Tolkien does not dwell on what the interrogation cost Gollum. The cost is implied by what Gollum became afterward, even more broken, even more fearful, even more desperate in his pursuit of the ring. Whatever Sauron's methods were, they did not improve Gollum. They did, however, release him. Sauron let Gollum go after the interrogation. This may seem surprising, but Tolkien explains the logic. Sauron understood that a free Gollum searching for the ring was more useful to him than an imprisoned one. Gollum would lead Sauron's servants to the ring eventually, or the ring would lead Gollum to Sauron's hands. Either way, a free and desperate Gollum moving through the world was a better instrument for Sauron's purposes than a confined one. Gollum was next captured by Aragorn in the wilderness between Mordor and the Misty Mountains, and brought to Mirkwood, where he was held by Thranduil's elves. It was during this period that Gandalf visited him and interrogated him in his own, less destructive way, and confirmed the information Gandalf needed to understand what the ring was and where it had gone. Gollum escaped from Mirkwood, which is one of the less explained events in the story. The elves of Mirkwood were supposed to be keeping him. They were not negligent, but Gollum was exceptionally capable of getting into and out of dark places, exceptionally skilled at disappearing, and the particular kind of energy that desperation gives an already dangerous creature had been greatly amplified by everything that had happened to him since his capture. He came south. He came toward Mordor, and then toward wherever the ring was calling him from. He found Frodo and Sam in the Emyn Muil. The question of what Gollum felt when he found Frodo is worth thinking about carefully, because Tolkien built something complex into their first encounter. Gollum's first instinct, always, was to try to get the ring by force, and Sam's presence complicated this because Sam was not going to stand by while anything happened to Frodo. Gollum tested the situation, probed it, and concluded that direct attack was not going to work. And then something else happened. Frodo called him Sméagol. Frodo spoke to him not as a threat or a tool, but as a person, using his original name, the name from before the ring, the name from before the murder and the exile and the centuries underground. Sméagol heard his own name spoken by someone who knew what it meant. The response in Gollum was not simple. It activated Sméagol, the smaller and weaker personality, in ways that briefly confused the larger and dominant Gollum. Sméagol wanted to respond to the kindness. Gollum was suspicious of it. The two personalities argued with each other, sometimes visibly, in the conversations Tolkien records between them. What Frodo was doing, intuitively, was exactly what Gandalf had told him earlier, treating Gollum with a mercy that might draw out what remained of the creature's goodness. Not because it was guaranteed to work, not because Frodo was certain it was a good idea, but because Frodo had carried the ring long enough to understand something about what it did, and because he felt, whether he would have articulated it this way or not, that Gollum deserved to be addressed by his original name. The relationship between Frodo, Sam, and Gollum on the road to Mordor is one of the most psychologically interesting extended sequences in the book. Sam saw Gollum clearly. Sam's clarity was not cruelty. Sam was right about what Gollum was capable of, and right about the general direction of Gollum's intentions. Gollum was using Frodo's sympathy, and was not fully converted to Frodo's cause, and was, at some level, still pursuing the same goal he had always been pursuing, to get the ring back. But Sam's clarity also prevented him from seeing what Frodo could see, that inside Gollum there was still Sméagol, and that Sméagol's survival mattered, not just sentimentally, not just as a moral exercise, but because Sméagol's presence in Gollum was the only thing that made Gollum useful to the quest. Frodo needed Gollum to guide them through the dead marshes and to Mordor's gates. No one else could do it, and Gollum would only guide them if Frodo kept alive the possibility, in Gollum's mind, that something good might come of the service. Sméagol had to believe, or half-believe, that Frodo was different from every other person who had used him, or threatened him, or tried to take the ring from him. This was partly manipulation on Frodo's part. He was aware of this, but it was also, and genuinely, compassion. The two things coexisted in Frodo's treatment of Gollum in the way they often coexist in real relationships with damaged people. The clear-eyed understanding of what the damaged person is capable of, and the insistence on treating them as if they were capable of more. The Dead Marshes sequence is among the most atmospheric and most disturbing in the novel. Gollum led them through miles of flat, boggy ground, where the bodies of men and elves and orcs from the ancient Battle of Dagorlad were preserved in the stagnant water, visible beneath the surface as pale faces with open eyes, lit by ghostly lights that were not the lights of any living thing. The marshes were Gollum's native element. He moved through them with confidence, never stepping where the ground would not hold, navigating the twisting paths between the pools of dead water with the sureness of someone who has traveled this route before. He knew the marshes because he had crossed them before, on his way south from the Misty Mountains, and they suited him. Darkness and rot and the smell of ancient death, and the particular loneliness of a landscape that had been the site of catastrophe. These were Gollum's natural habitat. He was also, in the marshes, more fully Sméagol than he had been elsewhere. The harshness of Mordor's outer terrain and the proximity of the ring and the memory of Sauron's attention all increased Gollum's dominance. But in the marshes, threading through the pale dead faces in the black water, Sméagol was something like content. He was doing something he was good at, in a place he knew, for a person who had called him by his name. It is a strange kind of joy that Tolkien gives Gollum in that sequence, but it is the kind of joy available to someone like Gollum, the joy of competence, of being useful, of being trusted with something. The moment when Gollum was closest to being saved, or as close as he ever got, was a night on the stairs of Cirith Ungol, before the betrayal. Tolkien describes the scene with extraordinary care. Frodo and Sam are asleep. Gollum comes back from wherever he has been, and stands over them. He sees Frodo sleeping, and for a moment, something in Gollum's face changes. Tolkien describes it as a look of something that Gollum had been before the ring, a flicker of something that had been buried under centuries of darkness and desire and pain. He reached out, almost, toward Frodo's hand. Then Sam woke. Sam looked at Gollum with the expression Sam always wore when looking at Gollum: suspicion, dislike, readiness. Sam's look was accurate. It was fair. It was the look of a hobbit who had seen through Gollum from the beginning and was not going to be deceived. And Gollum became Gollum again, and the moment was gone. Tolkien wrote, in a note about this scene, that this was the moment when Gollum's fate was sealed. That if Sam had said something different, or nothing at all, or if Gollum had been given even a few more seconds in whatever state he was in when he reached toward Frodo's hand, the outcome might have been different. Gollum might have made a different choice. The betrayal at Shelob's lair might not have happened. He also wrote, and this is crucial, that he did not blame Sam. Sam's response was natural and understandable, and in almost any other situation would have been the right response. The problem was not Sam's fault. The problem was that the moment was too delicate for what Sam's nature was, and Gollum's nature was, and the situation was. The weight of 5 centuries of corruption was heavier than one moment of something like grace could lift. Gollum led Frodo to Shelob and betrayed them. It was his plan from early in their arrangement. Tolkien allows us to see, in retrospect, that Gollum's service had always been oriented toward this: getting Frodo into a place where Frodo would be immobilized and helpless, where the ring would be separated from Frodo's will and Gollum could take it back. Shelob was Gollum's solution to the problem of Frodo being guarded by Sam. Sam came back. Sam fought Shelob. The plan failed in the specific sense that Gollum did not recover the ring at Shelob's lair. Frodo was captured by orcs, taken to the tower of Cirith Ungol, and Sam took the ring himself, in the belief that Frodo was dead and the ring had to be kept from falling into enemy hands. When Frodo was not dead, and Sam returned the ring to him, and they continued toward Mount Doom, Gollum was somewhere behind them, following the ring's trail. He caught up with them at the crack of doom. The moment at the crack of doom is the moment toward which everything in Gollum's story, and in the ring's story, and in Frodo's story, had been building. Frodo stood at the edge of the fire. He had carried the ring to the one place in the world where it could be destroyed. He had done this through an act of sustained will and sustained suffering that Tolkien describes as superhuman, because it was, no creature should have been able to carry the ring to that place. The ring's will was against it. Sauron's attention was on them. The mountain was breaking apart, and Frodo could not throw the ring in. He put it on instead and claimed it. The ring was his. It had been his, in a sense, from the moment he put his finger through it in the study at Bag End, from the moment it had first whispered to him, from the moment it had first become not just an object in his possession, but an object in relationship with his desire. 500 years earlier, it had whispered to Sméagol beside the Gladden River, and Sméagol had killed his cousin for it. Now it whispered to Frodo at the crack of doom, and Frodo said mine, and the claim was real, and the ring had won. And then Gollum attacked. He had been there, in the shadow, following, waiting for a moment when the ring was separated from Frodo's guarding hand. When Frodo put the ring on and became invisible, Gollum found him by feel and by long practice, and by the ring's own pull toward the creature who had held it longest. He bit off Frodo's finger. He took the ring back. He took it back for a moment, just a moment. Then he fell. The fall was not entirely accidental. Tolkien is careful here, and careful in his letters. Gollum was dancing on the edge of the crack of doom, lost in the possession of his precious, and in his ecstasy he lost his footing and went over. But there is something more in the description, something that Tolkien pointed to in various ways in his letters and notes. The fall happened because Gollum was, in that moment, incapable of caution. He was fully possessed by the ring, fully inside the relationship with the ring that had been consuming him for 5 centuries, and in that state, there was no self left to exercise the survival instincts that might have pulled him back from the edge. The ring destroyed Gollum, even as Gollum recovered it. The very intensity of their reunion was what killed him, and the killing completed what Bilbo's mercy, extended in a cave in the Misty Mountains 60 years earlier, had set in motion. Bilbo had not killed Gollum when he could have. Frodo had treated Gollum as Sméagol when he could have treated him as an enemy. Sam had not killed Gollum in the darkness of Shelob's lair when he had the opportunity. All of these mercies, extended to a creature who did not particularly deserve them and who would not have extended them to others, had kept Gollum alive to the moment when his fall into the fire was the only thing that could have destroyed the ring. Tolkien's theology of Gollum, worked out in his letters, is one of the most sophisticated and one of the most consoling things he ever wrote. He argued that Frodo's failure at the crack of doom was not, in the deepest sense, a failure. It was the operation of grace through unwilling instruments. The mercy extended to Gollum by Bilbo, by Gandalf when he chose to let Gollum live after his interrogation, by Frodo throughout their journey together. These were acts of grace whose consequences could not have been foreseen by those who performed them. Bilbo did not know, when he chose not to kill Gollum, that Gollum would one day fall into the crack of doom with the ring. He chose mercy because mercy was right, not because he calculated its consequences. The consequences were beyond calculation. Tolkien described this as the operation of providence through the ordinary choices of ordinary creatures. The choices were small and unspectacular. Don't kill the creature who cannot defend himself. Treat the damaged person by his original name. Don't drive him away before the moment is complete. These choices, accumulated across 60 years, produced an outcome that no amount of heroic direct action could have produced. The ring could not have been destroyed by an act of will. Tolkien was explicit. No creature in the world could have voluntarily thrown it into the fire at that moment. Not Frodo, not Gandalf, not Galadriel, not Aragorn. The ring's will was too strong. The only way it could go into the fire was if someone fell in with it, and the only creature likely to fall in with it was the one who had held it longest, who had the deepest and most destructive relationship with it, who would, when he finally got it back, lose himself completely in the having of it. Gollum was the instrument of the ring's destruction. He was also, in Tolkien's understanding, the instrument of Eru Ilúvatar's purpose, working through the long consequences of small mercies. Was Gollum evil? The question is real, and it does not have a simple answer, and Tolkien knew it did not have a simple answer. Gollum killed Déagol. He lied continuously. He tried to have Frodo killed by Shelob. He betrayed Sam and Frodo to the orcs. He bit off Frodo's finger. He had, across the 5 centuries of his story, behaved in ways that could not be defended as innocent or accidental. And yet, he had been a victim of the ring before he was anything else. He had not chosen to find the ring. He had not had the benefit of any warning about what it was. He was an ordinary creature without special virtue or special resilience, and the ring found him and remade him, and the person he became was not the person he would have been without it. Tolkien believed that no creature could be entirely reduced to what was done to it. He believed in the ineradicability of the original good, the original nature as it had been created, and he expressed this belief in the character of Sméagol, who persisted even under 5 centuries of the ring's corruption, who could still respond to his own name, who could still feel something like affection for Frodo, who stood over sleeping hobbits in the dark and reached toward a hand that had been kind to him. Sméagol was not dead. He was very small and very damaged and very submerged under Gollum's dominance. But he was there. Tolkien's answer to whether Gollum was evil was something like, he was a creature who had been made evil by something that should not exist, who retained within him a residue of original goodness that could not be entirely extinguished, and who was, in the end, used by a providence he could not have understood to bring about the world's greatest need. Sam's view of Gollum is the view most readers share. Gollum is dangerous and untrustworthy, and his sympathy for him is a weakness of Frodo's, rather than a strength. Sam loves Frodo enough to be suspicious of everything that might harm Frodo, and Gollum is clearly something that might harm Frodo. Sam is right. Sam is also missing something. What Sam misses, because Sam is Sam and not Frodo, is that Gollum's story is Frodo's possible story. Frodo knows this, at some level, from the moment he put on the ring and felt what the ring felt like. He knows that the difference between himself and Gollum is not a difference of fundamental goodness, but a difference of circumstances and time. Gollum had the ring for 500 years. Frodo had it for a matter of months. Given 500 years, Frodo would have become Gollum, or something very like him. This is not speculation. Tolkien makes it explicit through the way Frodo talks about Gollum, through the mercy he extends, through the deliberateness with which he insists on calling him Sméagol and treating him as a person with an original nature, and not merely as the creature the ring has made him. Frodo's compassion for Gollum is, at its deepest level, a form of self-knowledge. He knows what the ring does. He knows what he himself is capable of. He knows that the mercy he extends to Gollum is the mercy he hopes will be extended to him if he fails, and that the line between carrying the ring and being destroyed by it is thinner than it appears from the outside. The last time anyone sees Gollum, in the moment before he falls, he is described as holding the ring up over the fire and looking at it. His eyes are wide. His face is full of something that might be called happiness, if happiness were not too limited a word for it, if joy were not too light a word, if the word for what he feels in that moment had not been corrupted out of ordinary language by 5 centuries of debasement. He has what he wanted. Then he is gone. Tolkien does not weep over Gollum's death exactly. He does not make it elegiac in the way of heroic deaths. Gollum's fall into the fire is not described as a sacrifice, which it was not consciously. He did not choose to fall for a cause. He fell because he was lost in possession and could not save himself. But Tolkien does give Gollum a kind of dignity in the manner of his going. He had what he wanted in the moment before the end. The creature who had been looking for the ring for 60 years, who had been underground with it for 5 centuries before that, who had built his entire existence around it, died with it in his hand, in the moment of final and complete possession. The possession destroyed the ring. That is the irony and the grace of it. Gollum destroyed the ring by refusing, to the very end, to give it up. There is something in Gollum's story that speaks to a very old question, whether a creature so thoroughly damaged can be redeemed. Tolkien's answer, worked out carefully in his letters, is nuanced to the point of resistance to easy summary. He did not say that Gollum was redeemed. He said that Gollum was used, that the long mercy extended to him by multiple people across multiple decades made him available for a purpose that no one had foreseen or intended. He said that this was different from redemption in the full Christian sense, which requires the will of the one being redeemed to participate in the redemption. Gollum did not choose to destroy the ring. He chose to possess it. The destruction was the consequence of the possession, working through circumstances arranged by a providence that operated through Bilbo's and Frodo's and Sam's and Gandalf's unforeseeable choices. Whether Gollum, in the moment of falling, in whatever followed the falling, received something more personal than this instrumental purpose, is something Tolkien left open. He wrote, in one letter, that he hoped Sméagol had found something on the other side of the fire, not a reward, not a vindication, but perhaps a release from the weight of what he had been. Perhaps the first moment in 500 years when the ring's voice was not in his head. He wrote that hope carefully, without certainty, in the way of someone who understands that the fate of souls is not something he has authority to determine, even in a world he has made. The story of Gollum is, in the end, a story about what 500 years with an evil object does to an ordinary creature. It does not make the creature extraordinary. It does not give him superhuman powers or demonic intelligence or the kind of menace that commands respect. It reduces him. It takes what was ordinary and curious and perhaps a little selfish and makes it smaller and more desperate and more singular until the entire vast internal world that every person begins with has been reduced to a single point, the ring. Gollum's tragedy is the tragedy of reduction. He could have been many things. He was a store, and story were curious and capable and had their own culture and their own dignity. He could have lived his life and died his death and been part of the history of his people in the way of ordinary creatures, leaving small traces in the world the way ordinary people do. Instead, he became the creature that Tolkien describes, pale and thin and huge-eyed, crouching in the dark, talking to himself, reduced to a single want, unable to take pleasure in anything except the possession of the thing he wanted, and even in the possession unable to rest, always afraid that the possession would be taken, always planning for the contingency of loss. The ring did not give Gollum joy. Even at the crack of doom, in the moment of complete possession, what he felt was not joy, but the feverish intensity of someone who has finally stopped being afraid of losing something. That is not the same thing. That is the relief of someone who has been anxious for 500 years and has momentarily stopped. It is not happiness. It is the cessation of a specific kind of pain. One of the questions that haunts Gollum's story is whether the person he was before the ring, the curious, ordinary Sméagol by the river, would recognize what he became. I think the answer is no. I think if Sméagol by the Gladden River could have seen the creature he was going to become in 5 centuries, he would not have recognized it as himself. The reduction was so complete, the transformation so thorough, that the continuity between the person who went fishing with his cousin on a spring morning and the creature who crouched in the dark over a cold lake was almost entirely broken. Almost, not entirely, because Sméagol remained, in the diminished form we have seen, surviving in the spaces Gollum left. The capacity to respond to his own name, the capacity for something like loyalty, the capacity to feel, on that night on the stairs of Cirith Ungol, something toward Frodo that was not entirely self-serving. Tolkien believed that the original nature could not be entirely destroyed, that what Eru Ilúvatar had made of Sméagol was not entirely unmade by what the ring had done to him, that the original image remained, however damaged, however covered over, and that this was both the source of whatever hope there was for Gollum and the thing that made his final fate something other than simple. Let me close with what I think is the most important thing Tolkien ever said about Gollum. He said that Gollum was not a symbol of evil, he was a victim of it. And then he said something that has stayed with every serious reader of Tolkien who has encountered it. He said that the mercy extended to Gollum by Bilbo and Frodo was not wasted, that even though Gollum did not visibly benefit from it, even though he betrayed Frodo and tried to recover the ring and fell into the fire without any apparent experience of redemption, the mercy was not wasted, because the mercy was what kept Gollum alive to the moment when his fall was necessary, because the mercy operated through Gollum even when Gollum did not operate through the mercy, because the consequence of multiple ordinary creatures choosing to treat a damaged and dangerous person as if something of his original nature was worth preserving was the destruction of the most dangerous object in the world. This is not a comfortable conclusion. It does not resolve into a satisfying moral about the rewards of kindness. It does not say that being merciful will always produce good outcomes that you can see and feel good about. It says something harder and truer, that mercy operates on a scale and a timeline that is not visible from inside any single act of it, and that the correct thing to do is to extend it anyway, because the world is the kind of world in which it matters, even when the mattering is not visible. Bilbo did not know any of this when he chose not to kill Gollum. He just thought, it would feel wrong. He felt pity for the wretched thing. He chose mercy. And 60 years later, the world was saved. Sméagol went fishing. He found something beautiful and wrong in the river bottom. He killed for it. He spent 5 centuries being destroyed by it. He led the ring-bearer to Mordor. He fell into the fire at the moment the world needed him to fall. And somewhere in that story, between the fishing and the falling, is the whole argument about what grace looks like in a world that has been marred, about the instruments through which redemption operates, about the patience required to believe that mercy matters even when the mercy is refused and the damage continues and the fire is still many miles and many years away. The ring is gone. Mount Doom is quiet. The age of Sauron is over. And Sméagol, who was ordinary once, who had a grandmother and a cousin and a spring morning on a river, who carried more than anyone should carry, who was reduced to less than anyone should be reduced to, who could still hear his name when someone used it, who fell into the fire with what he loved in his hands, rests now beyond the reach of anything that can further diminish him. It is enough. It is, in the end, more than enough. The river that Sméagol fished in was the Gladden River, which flowed through the Gladden Fields in what is now the western margins of Rhovanion. In Tolkien's geography, the Gladden Fields were a marshy, grassy region at the confluence of the Gladden River and the Anduin, the great river that ran the full length of Middle-earth from the Grey Mountains to the Sea of Rhûn. This location matters because the Gladden Fields were also the place where Isildur died. Isildur, the king who had cut the ring from Sauron's hand at the end of the Second Age, who had refused to destroy it in the fires of Mount Doom, who had carried it north with him as he led his small army home, had been ambushed at the Gladden Fields. His men were killed. Isildur fled into the Anduin and put on the ring to become invisible and swam for his life. The ring betrayed him. It slipped from his finger in the water, and the orcs on the bank saw him and shot him with arrows, and Isildur died. The ring sank to the bottom of the Anduin. It lay there for roughly 2,000 years, gradually moving downstream as the river shifted, until it came to rest in the shallows near the confluence of the Gladden, where the river folk lived, where Sméagol and Déagol went fishing, where the spring day came that changed everything. The ring had been waiting. It was not aware, not exactly, not in the way that living beings are aware, but it had something like patience, something like purpose. It was Sauron's instrument, and it moved in the direction of Sauron's interests when the opportunity arose, and the opportunity arose when Déagol's hand closed around it in the river bottom. 2,000 years it waited. Then it found its next bearer. Sméagol's people, the Stores, were one of the 3 original Hobbit breeds that Tolkien describes in the prologue to The Lord of the Rings. The Harfoots were the most numerous and the most typical, the ones who eventually settled in the Shire. They were shorter and browner than the other breeds, more inclined to hills and uplands, great tunnelers and hole-dwellers from very early in their history. The Falahides were the fairest and tallest of the 3, more inclined to forests than plains, more open to relationships with elves and other peoples, the natural leaders and adventurers among the hobbits. The Stores were the largest and heaviest of build, the most comfortable with water, the ones most likely to be found near rivers and marshes, rather than hills and holes. They were also, of the 3 breeds, the ones with the most contact with men, which gave them a slightly less insular quality than the Harfoots. Sméagol was a Store, and his connection to the water, his ease in rivers, his natural inclination toward exploration of the riverine environment were all characteristic of his people. His fishing trip with Déagol was not an unusual activity for a Store on a spring morning. It was entirely in character. which means that in one sense, Sméagol's fate began not with any particular flaw in his character, but with his nature. He was a river person. The ring came from the river. If he had been a Harfoot in a hill country hole, the ring would not have found him. This is one of the darker aspects of Tolkien's ring mythology. The ring chose its victims through a combination of proximity and vulnerability, not through targeting the wicked, not through selecting those who deserved to be corrupted. It found whoever was near it when it was looking for a new bearer, and it worked with whatever it found. The quality of Sméagol's curiosity is worth dwelling on, because it is the quality that most directly connects him to Bilbo, and through Bilbo, to Frodo. Tolkien notes that Sméagol was of an inquiring mind before the ring found him. He liked to know things. He dug into the roots of mountains. He climbed trees to see what was there. He dove into pools to find what was at the bottom. He was the most curious of his people, which among hobbits and hobbit-adjacent creatures was saying something. Bilbo was the most curious hobbit in the Shire. Frodo was the most scholarly. The three ring-bearers, in sequence, were all characterized by a relationship to knowledge and exploration that distinguished them from their communities. Tolkien built this pattern deliberately, I think, though he did not explain it directly. The ring's bearers tended to be creatures for whom the ordinary world was not quite enough, who wanted to see what was over the next hill or at the bottom of the next pool. The ring appealed to them precisely because it offered something beyond the ordinary: power, invisibility, access to things that others could not reach. The desire to know and see was, in Sméagol's case, the opening through which the ring entered. He wanted to know what was at the bottom of the Gladden River. He found out. The curiosity that was Sméagol's most distinctive feature before the ring became, after the ring, the curiosity that the ring redirected toward a single object, itself. All of Sméagol's exploratory energy, which had been distributed across the river and the roots of mountains and the pools deeper than others would go, was collapsed into one focus: the ring. What it was, what it could do, how to keep it. The very thing that made him an interesting person was the thing the ring used to make him into Gollum. There is a philosophical question that Tolkien's Gollum raises, and that Tolkien himself raised explicitly in his letters, about the nature of free will in a world where an object of evil power can so thoroughly reshape a person's desires that the person effectively loses the capacity to choose anything other than what the object wants them to choose. Was Gollum free? In what sense could a creature who had been in continuous possession of the One Ring for 500 years be said to make free choices about anything? Tolkien's answer was careful. He argued that freedom, in his mythology, as in Catholic theology, was never simply a matter of being free from influence. No creature was free from influence. The world shaped everyone. Circumstances shaped everyone. The choices of others shaped everyone. The question was not whether Gollum was influenced by the ring, but whether the ring had so thoroughly overwritten his original nature that nothing of his original capacity for free choice remained. His conclusion was that something remained. Sméagol's persistence, his occasional responses to kindness, the moment on the stairs of Cirith Ungol when he reached toward Frodo's hand, these were evidence that Gollum retained, however attenuated, the capacity for something other than what the ring wanted. He could still make small choices. The capacity had not been entirely destroyed. Whether those small choices constituted freedom in any meaningful sense is a question Tolkien left open, because it is a question theology and philosophy have never fully resolved, not just for Gollum, but for any creature living in a world that is as coercively structured as ours. What he said is that the mercy extended to Gollum was not pointless, which is a different claim than saying Gollum was fully free. The mercy was not pointless because Gollum was not zero, because the residual Sméagol was real, because even a greatly diminished freedom responds to grace in ways that are not predictable from outside. The orcs who captured Gollum for Sauron's interrogation had been following a trail that Sauron had identified through other means. When Gollum escaped Mirkwood, he came south, and in coming south he came into range of Sauron's awareness, which by the late Third Age extended throughout the lands of Shadow and many of the lands beyond them. Gollum was brought to the Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower itself. Sauron was not yet fully physical again in the year of Gollum's capture, but his will and his awareness were increasingly concentrated, and the interrogation of Gollum was one of the most direct operations of Sauron's personal attention in the narrative of the Third Age. What Sauron knew before the interrogation was that the ring had been found and was somewhere in the west, among creatures he had not much attended to. What he needed to know was specific: who had it, where they were, what their name was. Gollum, under interrogation, gave him Baggins, gave him the Shire. Tolkien notes, in the backstory he laid out very carefully, that Sauron's first response to this information was not to immediately unleash the Nazgul. He was, in one sense, reassured. The ring was in the hands of a creature he had no reason to fear, a hobbit in a comfortable country who almost certainly did not understand what he had. He had time, he believed. He could deal with the situation carefully and confidently. He was wrong about having time, but his confidence was, from his perspective, reasonable. This is one of the subtleties of Tolkien's plotting. Sauron is not a bad strategist. His strategy, based on his information, was not unreasonable. The information was incomplete because Gollum did not know that Gandalf was already aware of the ring's nature, that the Council of Elrond had already been called, that the Fellowship was already formed. Gollum knew only what Gollum knew, and what Gollum knew, it turned out, was just enough to be catastrophically useful to someone, without being enough to determine the outcome. After Sauron released him, Gollum was hunted. Aragorn tracked him through the wilderness south of Mirkwood, a tracking feat that Tolkien describes as extraordinary, because Gollum was very good at not being tracked. He had spent centuries being good at moving through dark places without being seen or followed. He was thin enough to fit through gaps that would stop a larger creature. He was fast. He was quiet. He was motivated in the deepest possible way to avoid capture. Aragorn caught him anyway. This tells us something important about what Aragorn was capable of in his years as a ranger, before the War of the Ring, when he was Strider and the Shire hobbits thought of him as a weather-beaten man of dubious character sitting in a corner of the prancing pony. He delivered Gollum to Thranduil in Mirkwood. Gandalf came and interrogated Gollum there. The interrogation was entirely unlike Sauron's. Gandalf did not have access to the kinds of coercive methods that Sauron used, and in any case was not looking for the same information. He was looking for confirmation of what he already suspected. He got it. Gollum confirmed the ring, confirmed Bilbo, confirmed the history in the way that only someone who had direct experience of the ring could confirm it. Gollum's testimony was what finally convinced Gandalf of the truth he had been working toward for years. The elves of Mirkwood were not careless jailers. Thranduil's people were experienced, cautious, and well acquainted with the kinds of creatures who needed careful keeping. They let Gollum out into a forest clearing sometimes, under supervision, because even a prisoner needs air and light, and because Gollum's behavior had been relatively cooperative during his imprisonment, and because no one imagined he was capable of the escape that he eventually managed. He escaped with help. Orcs attacked Mirkwood, and in the confusion, Gollum was gone. He had, presumably, been in contact with the Orc scouts and arranged something, though the details are vague and Tolkien never specified exactly how the escape worked, only that it happened and that Gollum was then free. He went toward Mordor. He went toward the trail of the ring. That he ended up finding Frodo and Sam in the Emyn Muil, in the crumbled hillscape east of the Anduin, was a function of the ring's gravity as much as Gollum's tracking skill. The ring drew Gollum toward it in the way that one heavy object draws another across a great distance, through a force that operated below the level of conscious decision. When Gollum found them, it was because the ring was there, and Gollum could not have stayed away from the ring any more than water can flow uphill. The partnership between Gollum and Frodo on the road to Mordor is one of the most remarkable extended relationships in the novel, and it is remarkable precisely because it should not have worked as well as it did. Frodo had every reason to not trust Gollum. Gandalf had warned him. Sam warned him constantly. The history of what Gollum had done to Bilbo, the theft of the ring, the murderous fury when the riddle game was lost, was well known. The more recent history, the betrayal at Shelob's lair, that had not yet happened but that was coming, would bear out Sam's suspicion completely. And yet, Frodo maintained the partnership, maintained the practice of calling Gollum Sméagol, maintained the treatment of Gollum as a creature who retained something worth addressing, through all the months of their journey. Why? Partly necessity. Without Gollum, they could not navigate the Dead Marshes, or find the way to Mordor's eastern gate, or identify the secret stair at Cirith Ungol. Gollum knew the road, no one else did. But partly, and this is the part that elevates Frodo from simply a capable carrier of the ring to a genuinely extraordinary moral figure, because Frodo understood that the mercy was right, independent of its utility. He extended it not only because it was useful, but because something in him recognized that Sméagol deserved to be treated as more than what the ring had made him, and that this deserving did not depend on whether Sméagol's response to the treatment was gratifying or even positive. Mercy that is conditional on the recipient's response is not quite mercy. Frodo's mercy for Gollum was, at its best, unconditional. He called him Sméagol, not because Sméagol was going to behave like Sméagol, but because Sméagol was still there inside Gollum somewhere and deserved to be addressed. The name Gollum comes from the horrible swallowing or gurgling sound he made in his throat, a sound that Tolkien renders phonetically as Gollum, Gollum, the sound of something caught in the throat and not going down cleanly. It is a sound of physical distress, the sound of a body that is not working quite right, the sound of something being tried and failing, and tried again. The Gladden folk who named him with it were not being kind. They were labeling what he had become. He adopted the label. He used it for himself, in the third person, in the arguments he had with Sméagol. Gollum wants this. Gollum will not let Sméagol do that. Gollum is clever and has a plan. He referred to himself by his nickname as though Gollum were a separate person, which in a sense he was, the ring self, the dominant personality, the one who had taken over after Sméagol's original self was submerged. The use of the third person for oneself is, in psychology, associated with various states of dissociation, and with the kind of depersonalization that can accompany severe and sustained stress. It is the language of someone who has lost enough continuity with themselves that the pronoun I no longer feels accurate. Someone who refers to themselves as he is describing their own actions from the outside, as though observing a character in a story rather than inhabiting a self. Gollum was observing himself as a character in a story. The story had one plot: get the ring back. He was the character in that story, the original self, who might have had access to a larger story, to the story of a stoor by a river, who fished and dove and explored and grew old, and died in the ordinary way, was too far underground to be reached. The fish that Gollum caught in the lake under the misty mountains were a specific species that Tolkien, with his biologist's instinct for these things, described as blind, pale cave fish, adapted to the dark in the same way that Gollum himself had adapted to the dark, through the loss of features that required light to be useful. The fish had no eyes, or had eyes so vestigial as to be functionless. They navigated by pressure sensitivity and smell and whatever other senses work in water that never sees light. Gollum ate them raw because he had no fire and had forgotten how to make fire, and in any case preferred raw things, preferred food that was still alive when it went into his mouth, preferred the immediacy of the consumption without the intermediary of cooking. This is one of the most disturbing details in the novel, not because it is dramatic, but because of what it represents. The complete dissolution of the civilizing practices that distinguish a person who is part of a community from a creature who is purely surviving alone. Cooking is a social act. It is done for others as much as for oneself. It requires patience and planning, and the particular knowledge that comes from watching someone else do it. Gollum's abandonment of cooking was the abandonment of everything that went with it: the patience, the planning, the social context in which food is prepared and shared. He ate alone. He ate raw. He ate what he could catch with his bare hands. 500 years of that. There is a scene in The Two Towers that is often overlooked in discussions of Gollum, perhaps because it is uncomfortable in its specificity. Frodo has just caught Gollum trying to eat their elvish waybread, the lembas, and has prevented him from eating it, and Gollum is sulking. And Sam, watching, wonders aloud whether Gollum has always been like this, or whether he was different once. He thinks about it and concludes that he probably was different once, probably was ordinary, probably had people who knew him before the ring, and that the thought of that, the thought of who Gollum might have been, is sadder than anything about the creature Gollum has become. Sam does not say any of this to Gollum. He thinks it privately, in the way that people sometimes have their most generous thoughts about others in private and never express them. He keeps his suspicious exterior intact and his soft interior well guarded. But the thought is there. Sam, who is never sentimental about Gollum, who sees Gollum more clearly than almost anyone else, also sees this, that there was a before. That the creature crawling on the ground and sulking about waybread was once something else, and that the something else was probably not so far from what Sam himself was, an ordinary creature with a grandmother and a community and a life that was going in the ordinary direction. Tolkien gives Sam this moment because he wants us to feel it. He wants us to sit with the before, with the ordinary life that was disrupted so completely that nothing ordinary remained of it. Sméagol went fishing. The question of whether Gollum felt the ring's destruction is one that Tolkien raises and does not fully answer. In the moment before he fell, Gollum had the ring. He had recovered it from Frodo's bitten hand, and he was holding it, and then he was falling. The destruction happened when he and the ring entered the fire together. Whether Gollum felt the ring destroyed, whether there was a moment between falling and dying in which the ring was gone, and Gollum had a moment of existing without it, for the first time in 500 years, is something Tolkien did not describe. I find myself hoping that there was such a moment, not because it would vindicate Gollum or redeem the story's darkness, but because 500 years of compulsive possession seems like it should end with a moment of release. The moment in which the thing you have been desperately wanting is gone, and you discover, perhaps for the first time in 5 centuries, what it feels like to simply exist without the wanting. Tolkien wrote, in one of his most private and most careful letters, that he hoped Gollum had some good in the end, some moment of clarity or release, however brief, before the fire took him. He was not certain this was so. He was not willing to claim it as narrative fact, but he hoped. He hoped because the world he had made was a world in which mercy was not finally wasted, and the long mercy extended to Gollum deserved, in his imagination, to have some echo at the end. Perhaps there was such an echo. Perhaps in the moment before the fire, in the moment when the ring went to its ruin, Sméagol heard his name one last time from somewhere, from the part of himself that had been waiting underground for 500 years to be called by it. Perhaps he answered. The world that Tolkien built, in all its detail and all its depth, is a world that takes seriously the damage done to people by things that should not exist. It takes seriously the way that evil, once introduced into a person's life, can remake that person from the inside out, can take what was ordinary and good and reduce it until the ordinary and the good are nearly unrecognizable. It also takes seriously the resistance of goodness to that reduction, the ineradicability of the original nature, the persistence of Sméagol and Gollum, the capacity for mercy to reach the residual person even when the dominant person is closed to it. Tolkien was a man who had seen what war did to people, who had watched men come back from the trenches of the Somme as altered and diminished versions of who they had been, who had understood that the world contains forces that can do to a person in 4 years what the ring did to Sméagol in 5 centuries. The essential work is the same, even if the timeline is compressed. He was not writing about Gollum in the abstract. He was writing about everyone who has been in proximity to something that should not have existed, that remade them in ways they did not choose, that reduced their world to a single point until the single point was all they knew. For those people, and there are many, Tolkien's Gollum is something other than a monster. He is a portrait, not a flattering one, not an excusing one, but an honest one, with mercy built into the portraiture. Sméagol went fishing, and came up from the river with something that destroyed him. The river Anduin is still there, in the geography of Middle-earth, running its long course from the mountains to the sea. The Gladden Fields are there. The confluence of the rivers is there. If you walk to the right spot on the right bank, you would be standing near where Déagol fell in the water, near where Sméagol saw the ring in his cousin's hand and felt the wanting begin. The ring is gone. It cannot be there. It was destroyed in the fires of Orodruin, and what was made of it was unmade and returned to the raw materials of creation, which is what happens to things when they are unmade properly and completely. But the place is there, and in that place, 500 years before the story most of us know, an ordinary creature was on his way to becoming something terrible, by a process that was not entirely his fault, and that he did not fully understand, and that took everything from him except the thing the ring would not let him give up. He held on. That is the whole story, and the worst story, and the most human story. He held on until the holding could not continue, and then he fell, and the ring fell with him, and the world was saved. Not by heroism, not by an act of will that overcame impossible odds, but by a creature's inability to let go of a thing that was destroying him at exactly the moment when the not letting go was what the world needed. Grace works through strange instruments. Gollum was one of the strangest, and in the end, perhaps the most necessary. Let us go back to the river, one more time, and look at what the ring actually was when Déagol pulled it up from the mud. It was round and gold and plain, with no visible inscriptions, no gem, no distinguishing feature of craftsmanship except its quality. The gold was of a purity and smoothness that ordinary elvish or mannish or dwarven craft did not quite achieve. It was perfect in the way that things are perfect, when the maker was not limited by ordinary constraints and poured into the making not just skill, but will, not just craft, but self. Sauron made the ring in the fires of Orodruin around the year 1600 of the Second Age, which was approximately 4,500 years before Sméagol and Déagol went fishing. He made it in secret, or tried to, but Celebrimbor of Eregion, the greatest elven smith of the Second Age, felt the rings making the moment Sauron put it on, because the elven rings that Sauron had helped to craft vibrated in response to the one ring that now controlled them. The elves took off their rings immediately. The war that followed eventually destroyed the great elvish civilization of Eregion and killed Celebrimbor and scattered his people. The ring then passed through many hands. Sauron wore it. Isildur cut it from Sauron's hand. Isildur lost it in the Gladden River. The ring lay at the bottom for 2,000 years. Déagol pulled it up. Sméagol killed Déagol for it. The ring stayed with Gollum for 5 centuries. Bilbo found it. Bilbo carried it for 60 years. Frodo inherited it. Frodo carried it to Mount Doom. Gollum took it back. Gollum fell. The ring passed through 9 bearers in its full history. 9 creatures whose lives were changed and mostly destroyed by the possession of it. 9 examples of what proximity to a concentrated evil will does to ordinary and extraordinary beings alike. The Nazgul, the 9 ringwraiths, were the most extreme example of what the ring did to its bearers, because their bearing of lesser rings had made them completely subject to the One Ring's will. They had been great men in the Second Age, lords and sorcerers and kings who had been given rings of power by Sauron when he was still pretending to be a benevolent teacher named Anatar, the gift-giver. The rings had extended their lives enormously, had given them great power, and had gradually and completely made them Sauron's instruments. As the Third Age progressed, they faded. Their physical bodies became less and less substantial. They became wraiths, beings of will and shadow, powerful but hollow, capable of terror and destruction, but incapable of anything else. They wore black robes, because the robes gave them a shape. Without the robes, they were almost nothing, only the cold and the shadow and the fear that went before them. Gollum's 5 centuries were a movement toward this kind of wraith existence, though he never reached it. He retained his body, his voice, his particular kind of cunning, but he was moving, over the 5 centuries, in the direction of the Nazgul, toward a state where only the ring existed for him, where everything else had been stripped away, where he was more ring-shaped than person-shaped. The ring did not have enough time to finish the work with Gollum that it had finished with the Nazgul. 5 centuries was not long enough to complete the dissolution. 500 more years might have been, but 500 years was enough to do most of the damage. Bilbo Baggins deserves particular attention here, because his experience with the ring represents the other possible outcome for a bearer, and the comparison illuminates Gollum's tragedy by contrast. Bilbo carried the ring for 60 years. He found it, used it regularly, loved it in his own way, found himself increasingly reluctant to part with it. When Gandalf pressed him to leave it for Frodo, Bilbo reacted badly, accused Gandalf of wanting it for himself, briefly reached for it, caught himself. His departure from Bag End was not natural. He did not simply leave and forget the ring. He had to be guided, step by step, out of the relationship with it. But he did leave. He handed it over. He walked out the door and down the road, singing, and the relief in his singing was real. What made this possible? Several things. Bilbo was a hobbit, and hobbits had a natural resilience to the ring's corruption that even Tolkien acknowledged was somewhat mysterious. They were small creatures with strong appetites for ordinary pleasures, comfort, food, company, the familiar rhythms of home, and the ring's appeal to extraordinary power and invisibility and domination was less compelling to a hobbit nature than it might have been to a more ambitious nature. Also, Bilbo had 60 years, not 500. The damage was proportionally less. Also, Bilbo was in the Shire, which was a healthy environment, surrounded by hobbit community and ordinary pleasures, and Gandalf checking in on him regularly. Sméagol had none of these things. He had the ring and the dark cave and the cold lake, and 5 centuries without sunlight or company or anyone to call him by his name. The conditions that might have let him remain more himself were all absent. The contrast is not between Bilbo's virtue and Sméagol's vice. It is between Bilbo's circumstances and Sméagol's circumstances. Tolkien read extensively in medieval psychology, in the faculty psychology of the scholastic tradition that described the human soul as constituted by reason, will, and appetite, and the sinful condition as one in which reason had lost control of the other faculties. The ring, in this framework, was an instrument for accelerating and enforcing the disordering of the soul, for making appetite so overwhelming that reason could not operate, for making will a servant of the ring's purpose rather than the person's purpose. Gollum, after 5 centuries, had lost access to reason in any practical sense. Not because he was stupid, he was cunning and quick, and remembered things with the clarity of someone who had nothing else to think about, but because his reason operated entirely in service of a single appetite, the ring. He could reason about how to get the ring. He could reason about how to protect the ring. He could not reason about anything else, because there was nothing else. The faculty psychology described this as the corruption of the moral life, and it was also a description of addiction, though the scholastic thinkers would not have used that word. The behavior that Gollum exhibits, the obsessive focus, the narrowing of all desire to one object, the preference for the object over all relationships and all pleasures, the physical degradation that comes from neglecting the body in service of the compulsion, is recognizable to anyone who has encountered addiction in its most severe form. Tolkien was not writing addiction. He was writing about what an evil of immense power did to a person who had no defenses against it. But the phenomenology overlaps, and the overlap is not accidental, because Tolkien understood that the dynamics of corruption were real and present in ordinary human experience, and that the ring was an expression of those dynamics taken to their logical extreme. The question of Gollum's suffering is one that Tolkien returns to repeatedly, and that deserves to be addressed directly. Gollum suffered. He suffered from isolation, 500 years alone in a cave. He suffered from physical degradation, the pale skin, the enormous eyes, the bent body, the inability to bear sunlight. He suffered from the constant presence of the ring's voice in his head, the constant murmur of its desire, which was not comfort but compulsion, not companionship but control. He suffered from the split in his own personality, from the ongoing argument between Sméagol and Gollum that gave him no peace even in sleep. He suffered from loneliness in a way that is almost beyond articulation. He had been cast out of his community before the cave. In the cave he had only himself. When he spoke to the ring, he was speaking to an object that had no capacity for genuine response, that answered him only with more desire. He was alone with his own reflection for 5 centuries. And then he suffered from the loss of the ring, from Bilbo's finding of it, from the 60 years of searching, from the interrogation by Sauron, from the captivity in Mirkwood, from the betrayal at Shelob's lair that did not work out as planned, from the pursuit of Frodo and Sam across the wilderness of Mordor. None of his suffering produced wisdom. The ring did not allow suffering to produce wisdom, because wisdom requires the capacity to step back from immediate desire and see a larger pattern, and the ring had eliminated that capacity. His suffering only increased his desperation, which increased his willingness to do whatever was necessary to recover the ring. He suffered badly and uselessly, in the sense that the suffering produced nothing in him except more of the same. And yet Tolkien did not treat Gollum's suffering as irrelevant. He registered it. He built it into the portrait with detail and care. He asked us to feel it, not to excuse anything, not to diminish the real harm Gollum caused, but because the suffering was real, and because a world that does not register the suffering of even its most damaged creatures is not the kind of world Tolkien was building. When Tolkien wrote the scene of Gollum's death in the final drafts of the manuscript, he went through many versions before arriving at what he published. Some earlier versions gave Gollum more agency in the fall, some made it more clearly accidental. What he settled on was a middle space, Gollum dancing, ecstatic, beyond caution, and then gone. The dancing is important. He chose the word dancing. Gollum in that moment was not careful. He was not strategic. He was not calculating the next move. He was lost in the ring in a way that made him incapable of the self-preservation that had kept him alive for 5 centuries. The ring, in the moment of its recovery, had finally finished consuming him. There was nothing left to exercise the survival instincts that would have kept him back from the edge. He danced, and then he fell. It is, in its way, the most fully alive that Gollum is described as being in the entire novel, that moment of ecstasy and complete loss of self on the edge of the fire. And the most fully alive moment is the moment that kills him. The ring did not offer life. It offered the semblance of intensity that comes with complete possession, the feeling of wanting something and having it, which is not the same as being alive in any full sense, but is what the ring offered in place of full aliveness. At the crack of doom, with the ring in his hand, Gollum felt more than he had felt in 5 centuries, and then he was gone. There is a letter Tolkien wrote in 1963, late in his life, to a child who had written to ask whether Gollum was wicked. Tolkien's response was characteristically careful and characteristically kind. He said that Gollum was wicked in his actions, but pitiable in his circumstances, and that the distinction mattered. He said that pity did not mean approval and did not mean there were no consequences, but that it meant recognizing that the creature who did the wicked things had also suffered greatly before doing them, and that the suffering and the wickedness were connected in ways that made simple judgment insufficient. He then said something to the child that he said in various forms to adult correspondents as well, that Bilbo's pity for Gollum was one of the most important things in the book. Not just narratively, not just as a plot mechanism that kept Gollum alive to fall into the fire, but morally, as a statement about how the world works when it is working well. The world works well, in Tolkien's understanding, when ordinary creatures extend mercy to damaged creatures, not because they can see where the mercy will lead, but because mercy is right, and because the world is structured so that mercy, accumulated and extended by ordinary people over ordinary time, produces extraordinary consequences that no one planned and no one could have predicted. Bilbo did not plan to save the world when he chose not to kill Gollum. He just felt it would be wrong to kill him, and that was enough. 5 centuries. 5 centuries of sitting in the dark with a ring that whispered at him, and a lake that never changed, and a self that was shrinking year by year, and a name that was being replaced by a sound his throat made involuntarily. It is almost beyond imagining. And then, at the end of it, a small grey ship sailing east from the undying lands of the west, carrying no message for Gollum, no official acknowledgement, no statement that his 5 centuries had been noticed. Just the ring in the fire, just the world made new. Just the mercy of Bilbo's choice, echoing forward through 60 years, working its consequences through a providence larger than any of the people inside it could see. The ordinary life that Sméagol might have lived was impossible by the time the ring found him. He could not have been spared. But the extraordinary life he did live, the terrible and pitiable and ultimately necessary life, was not without meaning. It had the meaning that all lives touched by grace have, the meaning of being inside a story larger than themselves, of carrying a weight for reasons they did not understand, of being used by something that understood more than they did. Grace does not ask permission. It uses what it finds. Sméagol was ordinary. The ring found him. The mercy followed. And the world, improbably, was saved. Rest, strange creature. You earned whatever rest there is for the likes of you. There is one more thing that needs to be said about Gollum's 5 centuries underground, and it is something that most accounts of the story underplay: the sheer duration of his learning. Gollum was not idle in his cave. He was reduced, yes. He was diminished and darkened and pressed down by the ring's constant presence. But he also spent 500 years becoming, in his particular way, an expert. He became an expert on the cave system under the Misty Mountains. He knew every passage, every tunnel, every place where the ceiling came low and a large creature could not follow and a small one could slip through. He knew where the underground rivers ran and where they surfaced and where they went underground again. He knew the Misty Mountains from the inside in a way that no goblin had mapped and no dwarf had charted, because dwarves went where the ore was and goblins went where the raids were useful, and neither of them had a reason to spend 5 centuries mapping every crack in the stone. He became an expert on the lake. He could catch the blind fish at any depth, at any temperature, at any time of year. He knew their patterns and their behaviors. He knew how they moved in response to disturbance, and how long they took to return to normal, and where they gathered after long periods of stillness in the water. He became an expert on the stone, on the weight of it and the sound it made when you tapped it in different places, and what those sounds meant about the thickness of the wall and what lay on the other side, on the way water moved through stone and what it deposited and how long the deposits had been accumulating. He knew geological time in his own wordless way through the evidence that lay on the walls around him, and he became, above all, an expert on the ring. No one in Middle-earth knew the ring the way Gollum knew it. Not Sauron, who had made it, but who experienced it as an extension of himself, not as an object separate from his will, but as the expression of it. Not Bilbo, who had carried it for 60 years without knowing its nature. Not Frodo, who had carried it to Mount Doom, but in constant struggle against its will, rather than in the settled possession of it. Gollum had kept it for 5 centuries. He had handled it daily. He had spoken to it and argued with it and loved it and lost it and searched for it and found it. He understood its weight and its warmth and the particular quality of its whisper in a way that no one else could understand. This expertise made him invaluable to the quest in ways that Frodo and Gandalf both understood, even if they could not fully articulate it. When they needed to navigate to Mordor, they needed someone who knew Mordor's approaches from long and personal experience. When they needed to find the secret way through Cirith Ungol, they needed someone who had scouted it before. When they needed to understand how the ring might behave in the shadow of Mordor, they needed someone who had lived with it in a shadow. Gollum's knowledge, accumulated over 5 centuries of solitary and terrible expertise, was not separate from his suffering. It was the product of his suffering. He knew what he knew because he had endured what he had endured. Tolkien does not make this into a lesson about the utility of suffering. He is too honest for that. Gollum's expertise was not worth the 5 centuries. No knowledge is worth that. But the expertise was real, and it was used, and it mattered. What would have become of Gollum if Frodo had not appeared? The question seems counterfactual, but it illuminates the real trajectory of Gollum's existence. Without Frodo's appearance, Gollum was in pursuit of the ring through whatever means were available to him. He knew the ring was somewhere in the Shire, in the possession of a Baggins. He had no specific intelligence after his time in Mirkwood and his flight south. He was following the ring's general direction, moving toward the smell of it, the pull of it. He might have found the Shire. He might have found Bag End. He might have found Frodo, not as a guide to Mordor, but as an enemy to overcome, and from whom to recover the ring by whatever means his cunning could devise. He might also have led the Nazgul to the ring's location, because Sauron was still watching Gollum, still using Gollum as a tracker without Gollum's knowledge or consent. Gollum's movements were information to Sauron, even when Gollum thought he was acting independently. The appearance of Frodo and Sam in the Emyn Muil changed the dynamic entirely. It meant Gollum did not have to find the ring found him. And Frodo's treatment of Gollum, the mercy and the name, changed what Gollum did next. Instead of attacking, he guided. Instead of leading the Nazgul, he led the ring-bearer. The small act of mercy, The decision to call him Sméagol redirected a dangerous creature's energy from threat to instrument. Not reliably, not permanently, not without the subsequent betrayal, but for long enough. There is a pattern in Gollum's story that Tolkien builds with the care of someone who has thought about it for decades. Every time a mercy is extended to Gollum, Gollum has a brief window in which something like goodness is possible for him. Bilbo's mercy in the cave. Gollum, if he had acted better in the riddle game's aftermath, if he had kept the rules rather than planning to eat Bilbo regardless of the outcome, might have had a different story. Gandalf's mercy in not pressing for Gollum's execution after the interrogation in Mirkwood. Gollum, given his freedom and the open world, came eventually to the point where Frodo found him. Frodo's mercy in calling him Sméagol, Gollum, briefly and genuinely, seemed to be becoming the guide he had promised to be. At each of these moments, Gollum was given an opening. At each of them, the ring's hold was slightly loosened, the dominant personality was slightly suppressed, and Sméagol had a little more room. And at each of them, Gollum closed the opening. Not immediately and not dramatically, but gradually and certainly, the ring's dominant purpose reasserted itself and the opening closed. The pattern is not one of redemption. It is one of grace offered and grace refused, offered again and refused again, with the refusals getting gradually more costly and more final. This is not because the people offering the grace were not sincere. They were sincere. It is because the damage was very deep, and the ring's hold was very strong, and 500 years of corruption did not yield to 60 years of mercy. What it did yield to was the fire. That was what it took. I want to spend a moment on the physical texture of Gollum's existence in the cave, because it is something that readers often skim past in their absorption with the psychological drama, and it is worth holding. The temperature of the cave would have been constant, somewhere around 10 degrees Celsius, the temperature of deep rock, unchanging year-round, cold but not freezing, cold enough that warmth was perpetually absent, that the body never had the relief of actual warmth, that the background physical experience of every day was a mild, persistent cold. The darkness would have been complete on most days. Gollum had fish oil lamps at some point, perhaps in the early years, before he had completely forgotten the practices of ordinary life. But by the later centuries, there would have been no light at all. His navigation of the cave would have been entirely by touch, and by the sound of the water, and by the memory of paths he had walked hundreds of thousands of times. The sound of the lake in the dark. That would have been the constant of his existence, the small sounds of water that never goes completely still, the distant drip from the cave ceiling, the occasional ripple from a fish near the surface, the particular echoes of the underground space that vary depending on where you are standing relative to the water and the walls. He would have listened to those sounds for 500 years, and in the sounds, the ring's whisper, always there, always just below whatever else there was to hear, steady as the drip from the ceiling, persistent as the cold. The Misty Mountains, where Gollum's cave was located, are the great north-south mountain range that divides the western lands of Middle-earth from the lands of the elves and men, from the eastern lands that lead eventually toward Rhûn and Mordor and the far south. The Goblin Town, the Goblin stronghold where Bilbo arrived after his fall from the mountain path, and where Bilbo and Gollum's first meeting preceded his loss of the ring, was located in the upper levels of the mountains above Gollum's lake. The goblins and Gollum had a relationship of mutual avoidance. Gollum occasionally ate a goblin when one came too close to the lake. The goblins knew about the creature in the dark below them and were afraid of it. Being afraid of Gollum required a particular kind of imagination, because Gollum was small and physically unimpressive except in his speed and his climbing ability and his adaptation to darkness. But the goblins of the Misty Mountains had imagination enough. something that lived alone in the dark for centuries and ate their kind when they came near, was something to stay away from. Gollum was, in his own cave, a kind of local legend, a monster in the dark below. A thing to warn young goblins about. He had been an ordinary store hobbit once. Now he was a monster in local legend. The ring had done that too. Let me tell you what Gollum remembered, toward the end. He remembered fish, specifically and in detail, because fish was the substance of his diet for 5 centuries, and he thought about fish the way hungry people think about food, with a kind of obsessive precision. He knew how the blind cave fish smelled when they were freshest, how they felt when they were alive and wriggling in his hand, how the taste changed depending on the time of year and what the fish had been eating in the deeper parts of the lake. He remembered his grandmother. Not clearly, not in the way you remember people you have continued to know, with the clarity of recent interaction, but in the way you remember people you knew before a great rupture, with the haziness of very old memory, the details lost and only the emotional impression remaining. His grandmother had been powerful in the community. She had driven him out. The memory of her was tangled with the memory of the exile, which was tangled with the memory of Déagol's death, which was tangled with the ring. He remembered Déagol's face. He remembered the spring day. He remembered the ring catching the light in his cousin's hand. He thought about these things, in the centuries underground, not with remorse and not with nostalgia, but with the flat, affectless recall of someone for whom the past is neither better nor worse than the present, because the present has consumed all available emotional resources. He remembered because memory was what he had, and memory in the cave was just another noise, like the drip from the ceiling and the sound of the water. The river that Déagol fell into was the Gladden. It flows today, in the world that was, into the Anduin. The Anduin flows south, past Rauros and the falls, past the mouths of the Anduin, into the sea. The ring is at the bottom of Orodruin. It has been there since the end of the Third Age. It cannot be at the bottom of the Gladden, because it was never there again after Déagol pulled it up. But the river is there, and the meadows are there, and somewhere in the grass near the confluence, on a spring morning long ago, 2 store hobbits were fishing. The older cousin reached for the ring in the younger cousin's hand. The younger cousin said no, and the world lurched toward its long, unlikely salvation. One ordinary act of wanting, on a spring morning by a river, set everything in motion. 5 centuries of suffering, the corruption of one creature and the preservation of another, the mercy of Bilbo, the mercy of Frodo, the mercy of Gandalf, the quest of the ring, the destruction of Sauron, the beginning of the age of men, all of it from one moment, one wanting, one hand reaching across a boat for a thing that caught the light. Sméagol's hand, the ring. And what followed? Thank you for joining Lords and Lions as we spent 500 years with Sméagol and tried to understand how he became Gollum. His story is one of the most human things Tolkien ever wrote, wrapped inside the most tragic. We hope it stays with you. We will see you next time.